In a bustling city where skyscrapers touched the clouds and millions of dreams competed for attention, there lived a 23-year-old man named Daniel. Daniel worked at a small marketing firm, earned a modest salary, and lived in a tiny apartment with walls so thin he could hear his neighbor's television every night. But Daniel had a problem that was slowly eating him from the inside. He couldn't stop comparing himself to others. Every morning, Daniel would wake up and immediately reach for his phone. He would scroll through social media for hours, watching his college friends post pictures of their new cars, expensive vacations, and promotions at big companies. His high school classmates were getting married, buying houses, and starting successful businesses. Meanwhile, Daniel felt stuck in the same routine day after day. The comparison trap had become Daniel's prison. When he saw his friend Mark post about his new Tesla, Daniel would look at his old bicycle and feel ashamed. When his cousin shared photos from her trip to Europe, Daniel would stare at his empty savings account and feel worthless. When his former roommate announced his engagement, Daniel would think about his own loneliness and feel like a failure. Daniel believed that everyone else had figured out life while he was still struggling to find his way. He would spend sleepless nights wondering what was wrong with him. Why wasn't he as successful as others? Why couldn't he afford the things his friends had? Why did everyone else seem so happy while he felt miserable? One rainy evening, after another day of comparing himself to others online, Daniel decided he couldn't take it anymore. He had seen enough posts about other people's achievements, enough photos of their perfect lives, and enough reminders of his own perceived failures. He needed answers. He needed to understand why he felt so trapped and how he could break free from this cycle of comparison that was destroying his peace of mind. That's when Daniel remembered something his grandmother had told him years ago. She had mentioned a wise old woman who lived in the mountains outside the city. This woman had once been a successful therapist who helped people overcome their deepest struggles. After retiring, she moved to a quiet cottage where she occasionally offered guidance to visitors who truly needed help. Daniel knew he had to find this woman. The next weekend, he took a long bus ride through winding mountain roads until he reached a small village. After asking several locals for directions, he finally found the cottage his grandmother had described. It was a simple wooden house surrounded by beautiful gardens and tall pine trees. An elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair was sitting on the porch, reading a book. Daniel approached her nervously and said, "Excuse me, are you the woman who helps people with their problems? I've been struggling with something and I really need guidance." The woman looked up and smiled gently. "What brings you to my doorstep, young man?" she asked. Daniel took a deep breath and explained everything. He told her about his constant comparisons, his feelings of inadequacy, and his inability to appreciate his own life because he was always focused on what others had. The woman listened patiently without interrupting. When Daniel finished, she nodded and said, "I see your pain and I understand your struggle. But before I can help you, I need you to do something for me. Are you willing to complete a simple task?" Daniel eagerly agreed, hoping this would be the solution to his problems. The woman stood up and led him to her backyard, where she had a beautiful vegetable garden. She handed him a basket and said, "I want you to pick vegetables for tonight's dinner. But here's the important part. While you're picking, I want you to focus only on finding the most perfect vegetables you can. Look for the biggest tomatoes, the straightest carrots, and the most flawless peppers." Daniel thought this was an odd request, but he didn't want to disappoint her. He spent the next hour carefully examining every vegetable in the garden. He would pick up a tomato, notice a small blemish, and put it back. He would find a carrot that seemed good, but then spot a straighter one and choose that instead. He compared every vegetable to every other vegetable, trying to find only the absolute best ones. After what felt like forever, Daniel returned with his basket. But something strange had happened during his time in the garden. Instead of feeling satisfied with his selection, he felt anxious and frustrated. He had spent so much time comparing vegetables that he had barely enjoyed the peaceful garden, the fresh mountain air, or the satisfaction of the simple task. The wise woman looked at his basket and then asked, "How do you feel about the vegetables you chose?" Daniel replied, "Honestly, I'm not sure. I spent so much time trying to find perfect ones that I'm still wondering if I made the right choices. I keep thinking about the vegetables I left behind." The woman smiled knowingly. "And how did you feel while you were picking them?" Daniel paused and realized something important. "I felt stressed and worried the whole time. I couldn't enjoy the process because I was so focused on finding the perfect ones." This was just the beginning of Daniel's journey toward understanding. The wise woman had shown him something profound through this simple exercise, but he didn't fully grasp its meaning yet. What he was about to learn would completely change how he viewed his life and his relationship with others. The woman gestured for Daniel to sit beside her on a wooden bench overlooking the valley. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. She looked at the basket of vegetables Daniel had collected and said, "Tell me, what made you choose that particular tomato over the others?" Daniel picked up the tomato he had selected and examined it again. Well, it was bigger than most of the others, and it didn't have any visible spots or imperfections. I thought it was the best one in the garden. The woman reached into the basket and pulled out a smaller tomato that Daniel had rejected. It had a tiny mark on its skin and wasn't perfectly round. "And what about this one? Why didn't you choose it?" Daniel looked confused. "It's obviously not as good. It's smaller, and it has that mark on it. Anyone would choose the bigger, perfect one." The wise woman smiled and stood up. "Come with me to the kitchen. Let me show you something that might surprise you." Inside her cozy kitchen, she cut both tomatoes into slices. The perfect tomato Daniel had chosen looked beautiful on the outside, but when cut open, it was pale and flavorless. The smaller, imperfect tomato he had rejected revealed rich, deep red flesh with an incredible aroma. "Taste both," the woman instructed. Daniel bit into the perfect tomato first. It was bland and watery. Then he tried the imperfect one and his eyes widened. It was sweet, juicy, and full of flavor. The woman sat down across from him and said gently, "You see, Daniel, you spent all that time in my garden doing exactly what you do in your life. You were so busy comparing and judging based on appearances that you missed the true value right in front of you." Daniel felt a strange sensation in his chest. Something about her words resonated deeply, but he wasn't sure he understood completely. "Your friend Mark with the new car," the woman continued. "Do you know if he's happy? Do you know if he's drowning in debt to afford that lifestyle? Do you know if he lies awake at night worrying about things you can't see?" Daniel shook his head slowly. He had never considered these possibilities. He had only seen the shiny surface. "And your cousin with her European vacation," she went on. "Do you know if she saved for 2 years to afford that trip? Do you know if she works 60 hours a week at a job she hates? Do you know if she posted those photos to hide her loneliness?" Again, Daniel realized he knew nothing about the real stories behind the images he had been envying. The woman reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "Daniel, you have been living your entire life like you picked those vegetables today. You see only the outside, the surface, the parts people choose to show. But life is like these tomatoes. The real beauty, the real flavor, the real value often comes from places you never think to look." Daniel felt tears forming in his eyes as the truth of her words began to sink in. But how do I stop? How do I stop seeing everyone else as better than me? How do I stop feeling like I'm failing at everything? The wise woman stood and walked to her window, looking out at the mountains. "The answer is simpler than you think, but it requires courage. You must learn to tend your own garden instead of staring over the fence at your neighbors." She turned back to face him. "Every morning when you wake up and reach for that phone to see what others are doing, you are abandoning your own life. You are telling yourself that their story matters more than yours. But Daniel, you have a story too. You have dreams, talents, experiences, and a purpose that belongs only to you." Daniel wiped his eyes and asked, "But what if my story isn't as interesting or successful as theirs?" The woman laughed softly. "Success is not a competition, my dear boy. It's not a race where someone wins and everyone else loses. Success is deeply personal. It's about growing into who you're meant to be, not becoming a copy of someone else. The woman walked Daniel to the door as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. She handed him a small seed and said, "Plant this in your own garden. Water it daily, tend to it with care, and watch it grow. Stop looking over the fence to see how other gardens are doing. Your seed will bloom into something beautiful and unique, but only if you give it your attention." Daniel returned to the city with a new understanding. He deleted social media apps from his phone and started focusing on his own growth. He took evening classes, pursued hobbies he had always wanted to try, and slowly began to appreciate the simple joys in his own life. Months later, he realized that true happiness had never been about having what others had. It was about nurturing what was already within him. From that day forward, Daniel lived by one simple truth. The grass isn't greener on the other side. It's greener where you water it. When you stop comparing and start living, you discover that your life was always enough. You just needed to see it with grateful eyes.